I'm an Australian guy living here in Belarus, and today I'm going to answer some questions that you've left for me under previous videos. First up, we have Andrew Stoffart. The things I noticed, and this is regarding Belarus, homogenous society, no immigration. I'll stop there, I'll address point by point. Yeah, that's fair to say. There's no kind of mass waves of different cultures and ethnicities coming in of recent years. This is very true. If you know the history of Belarus, of course, Belarus has not always just been this little square block. It has had bits cut off, and in one empire there and one empire there. So you do have some mixed ethnicities. Maybe it's not as obvious to the naked eye, but you do have some Europeans, especially in the southwest corner. You have a lot of mixing between Belarusians and Europeans in Brest and Grodno, for example, whereas kind of over Gomel, which is right near Kiev there, it's very, very Slavic, very Soviet kind of vibes. So yeah, it kind of depends how deep you want to deep, but as a general rule, it seems to be reasonably homogenous. This is true. A lot of Chinese around, Chinese students. You get a lot of these, especially in Minsk. No fat people. True and not true. Let me explain. When you look at the BMI index data, there's as many fat people, which are overweight and obese. You know how there's like skinny, underweight, normal, or healthy, or whatever they call it. Overweight and obese. If you look at the overweight and obese put together in America and Belarus, it's pretty much the same proportion of the whole population. The difference is that in the US, for example, a lot more people are obese. So you get people who are 50 kilos plus overweight. Whereas in Belarus, look, you get a lot of chubby people too, man. Like, obviously you've been a lot in Minsk, in the city center of Minsk, maybe around a lot of younger people, but when you get into the suburbs and you see what normal people are like, they're just as podgy as Americans, but they're just podgy, you know, plus 15, 20, maybe 25 kilos, whereas Americans are, as I said, plus 50, 60, 70 kilos. So next up, Andrew says that women are more elegant. That's an interesting one. I would say they present themselves as that, physically. That's pretty fair assessment, and certainly on initial contact and public image, I would say so, but public image is very important in a place like Belarus. And I think behind closed doors, you might see that they're not quite as elegant as you may first think. But look, they probably still are more elegant than, say, women in the USA, as an example. So yeah, probably pretty fair call. A lack of patience when queuing. Abrupt service. Lack of patience when queuing. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think it's mixed. I think some places there's quite orderly queues, and other places maybe people push in a little bit. But look, inner city Minsk, at the market there, people are pretty good at queuing in general. Abrupt service, that can be pretty real. That's pretty real, abrupt service. You can get a lot of, you definitely don't get the fake smile like, how are you today? You don't get that. It's like, что хочешь? Один курица. Что еще? Like this, stealing. Что еще? Что еще? This is kind of how it is. It is like this a bit. Yeah, you're spot on. I do agree with this. And what you kind of get when you mix in people who aren't queuing very well with abrupt service, as you put it, you get some nice arguments. And man, you see some good fights every now and then. Andrew also makes the point that there's a lack of smiling. Yeah, there's definitely a lack of smiling. Yeah, it's changing though, as Minsk becomes more westernized, Minsk becomes more westernized. It is changing a bit, and certainly to a foreigner, they're more likely to smile and show some curiosity. But I think, yeah, once you get into the burbs, once you get into smaller cities, you're pretty right. Like, people don't smile for no reason. People only smile if there's a reason to smile. And finally, agree no litter or crime. So yeah, definitely no litter. People just look after stuff in general. There's very little in the way of graffiti and that kind of stuff. You just don't get that low-level civil disobedience. And the last bit was crime. Well, yeah, definitely lack of street crime, lack of obvious in-your-face crime, no gang activity, no obvious drug taking, etc., etc. Next question coming at us from Scarborough Man. Very interesting, Scarborough Man says. It's an incredible difference from the cost of putting a roof over your head in Canada. All right, so this is when I went down to a town called Legation, checked out this just mansion cabin thing that had multiple buildings, 8 bedrooms, something like this. And it was only about 50 grand US. So why is it so much cheaper? Quite a few reasons. First of all is very simple supply and demand. Belarus is shrinking. The population is shrinking. A town like the one I went to has like a 50% delinquency rate. There's empty houses everywhere, which are essentially free. I mean, you can buy a normal house in a town like that for about 10 grand because supply demand. There's lots of them there and no one wants them. The kids inherit them. They don't want to live in some little town. They want to move to Minsk and get a job and blah, blah, blah. So they just have no value. Like the value is the land, which also has very little value. Whereas Canada or Australia or what have you, we have this organized long-term migration plan. So the population is going to keep going up by a lot. So if you own a house in a good area, then the demand for that just keeps going up, but the supply is fixed, right? There's more houses in worse areas and further from the city, but if you're in like a decent spot, near a beach, whatever it is, the value will just keep going up, just basic supply and demand. And of course, incomes are entirely different. I mean, the average income, nominal income in Canada is probably like 8 times higher than Belarus. And of course, Belarusians live better than that because the prices are a lot lower, but the earnings is a lot higher in Canada. So you're seeing 50,000, you're thinking, well, that's cheap. Third thing, and this is massive, man, they don't really have a borrowing and lending market here, right? So the problem in the West is that interest rates are so low that people have just been borrowing so much money for so long that it's bid up the prices of houses, right? I actually, when I was an economist in a previous life, I did a study on this, and more than half of the price increases in the West during this time period I studied was simply because of lower interest rates. People just keep pushing, borrowing more and more and more, and that's what's driving the price up. Simply just don't have this in Belarus. I think the borrowing rates are like 20% or something, so no one borrows money. So these 3 factors are really big in turning what's a $50,000 property here into maybe a $2 million property in Canada. And the reality is, if you bought like this a simple house here in a town for $10,000, you may never find a buyer for it. If you want to sell it, you may not be able to sell it. Next up, we have a question from Gene Canfield. I can tell you, as a Yank, Yankees slang for USA if you don't know, that in the last 3 years, the states have become broken, dangerous, and very third world. Everything seems broken with no repairman in sight. The political correctness has devolved into a mentally ill cult. The big cities are crime-ridden, drug-infested hellholes. Every one of your videos makes me want to check out Belarus as a new beginning, if I can find a safe way into the country. Whew, that's juicy. All right, well, I would say, before you even think about Belarus, think about better the devil you know, because in America, you know the pros and cons, right? And quite frankly, America's a very diverse country. So there are plenty of neighborhoods and plenty of cities where you're not going to have those problems. So your first port of call, if you're worried about crime and like political correctness or culture war stuff, whatever you want to call it, would be to move somewhere where that's not really there, right? There's options in America. So I would really take that as a first port of call. In terms of the crime-ridden and drug-infested, you're not going to get that here. You're not going to get, at least low-level street crime, you're not going to get here. You can walk alone at night, 4 a.m., 2 a.m., midnight, anywhere you want, and you will have no problems. Snuck over to Vilnius the other day, and I was only there for a day, and I saw a needle on the ground, a syringe, and I was like, you heathens. And then I saw a drug deal right in front of my face. It's like, what is this behavior? And then you mentioned that political correctness has devolved into a mentally ill cult. This is global, so this kind of cultural thing, this is global. It's getting pushed in here too. It's not as obvious because the government's very against this at the moment. But if you look at, for example, in the universities, this kind of stuff's coming through here as well. It's just not as advanced and doesn't control the society as much as it does in the USA. These are kind of general concerns that people who come from the States, for example, have when they come to Belarus. As I say, Belarus isn't exactly perfect either, and yeah, you kind of got to know the pros and cons of everywhere you're going before making that kind of decision. But it does sound like you're probably fairly political, and I would say that maybe 65-70% of the guys here who are foreigners are quite political and quite probably on your side of politics. So you'll definitely find some people to talk to about these kind of things if you want to. Especially younger guys. I'm really interested to see this. Guys are my vintage, right? Like we're kind of political, but we kind of just are pragmatic as well. It's just like, well, just get on with your life. Whereas the younger guys are they're really hardcore about their politics. So if you're a younger guy like that, you'll probably find a lot of mates here from Western Europe and from the States. Next up, we have Raphael Torres. Well, it sounds like you better go back to your own country to look for love. If those Belarusian people keep on the way they're going, they'll end up like Japan, that's slowly becoming extinct because women having too much pride. Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I've responded there. You can see Australia and Belarus, massive global issue. Stay up with your data. Japan has kind of like edged their birth rate up again. It's now places like Korea, which could literally just implode like in the next decade or two. It's crazy. All those East Asian countries are really off the charts. All the Chinese, kind of Chinese ethnic states, if you will, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, even the Chinese communities inside of places like Malaysia, Indonesian, like they're just not having kids. Yes, Belarus is kind of headed in that direction, although the government pumps in so many resources to try to get people to have kids, and it's working a little bit. Like, for example, if you have 3 kids here, you can get an apartment essentially for free. So I've heard some people say it's free, some people say it's like 70% off or 90% off, something like this. Close enough to free for a 3-bedroom apartment if you have 3 kids, right? So that's pretty serious. And women get maternity leave, 3 years maternity leave. So you kind of got this, outright bribery from government to encourage people to have more kids. And of course, this is what everyone's doing, every government in the world's doing. Now, the government here is doing all of this to help, but the fertility rate is still way below where it needs to be to maintain the population, right? So this is a massive global issue, as I say in the comment section there. There's pretty much, when you look at the data for this, there's pretty much nowhere you can go where people are still having children. Like, it just barely exists unless you want to go to some tribe in the middle of nowhere. Otherwise, it's barely happening. And one thing I think you're spot on about, when you look at birth rates in most like Western countries, they're actually higher than a lot of Eastern European countries. All right, that's enough from me. If you need help getting to Belarus, understanding what to do once you get here, finding accommodation, buying accommodation, meeting women, etc., do hit me up on my website, marriedinminsk.com.